So this one today is going to talk a bit about party fortunes from the year 1918 to pre-Thatcher. And the main thing to know, after World War One, the UK had 3.2 billion of war debts, and the global markets absolutely crashed. And for 1918, the Liberal Party was the one in charge. The Liberal Party, at the start, some of its main policies, they were a party of reform, implementing work pensions and things like that. They supported small government and free trade. So, for those that don't know what that is, free trade is just basically trading with other countries, particularly at this time European countries, without tariffs. However, just before World War One, so 1914, the Liberal Party was suffering through a few different lenses. You had the Home Rule in Ireland, so a lot of uprisings there that was causing them problems. You had the women's suffrage movement, and you also had the rising Labour movement, which obviously became the Labour Party itself. And the key thing with the Liberal Party to know is that obviously they won the election in 1914, so it was quite united. But by the end of it, they were completely separated in the party. All the ranks were going at each other, a bit like case saw the Conservatives with Brexit. Similar situation happened with the Liberal Party. This was due to the Liberal Party during the war. They implemented things like conscription. So you saw the state rising in its power, and some of the Liberals thought that was against its main policies and everything it stood for. In 1916, Asquith was no longer the leader. David Lloyd George was, and obviously, when a party changes the leader, it doesn't always get the backing of every single member of that party. So the party was completely split between those two leaders, and that split in the end turned into Asquith and David Lloyd George actually leading two different Liberal parties. And if you think about it, if the party splits, the electorate that vote for it is going to split. And if it splits, you're not going to get in power. And that's why the Conservative Labour Party in the end started to do better than them. So now it's a bit about the Labour Party. So that was basically representing the Trade Union of Congress, which officially established itself in the year 1900. Labour movement, a bit like today, which it says like its traditional supporters are the working class. And the Labour Party, to be fair, started to gain some ground in the political field before World War One. In 1906, it already had 1 million members subscribed to the party, and already has turned 29 members of Parliament. In 1911 election, it already had 40, so from 29 to 40, 5 years, it was already gaining ground. But in 1911, it became easier for the working class to get elected for MP. It now allowed MPs to get wages. And obviously, before then, if it was a job you didn't get wages for, it was the rich that had jobs elsewhere or businesses or had inherited lots of money. Now it was actually able to be a career path. And for obviously, for people like a little bit lower down in the working class or the lower middle class, this was a great place for an aspiration for an occupation. Obviously, this now it changed the electorate because now you have this working class rising, which the parties had to now account for to get their vote. And a piece of legislation called the Representation of the People Act of 1918 saw the electorate, so the amount of people who could actually vote for a party, rose from 7 million to 21 million. Now I'll give you a little bit of background at the Conservative Party. So the Conservative Party, a little bit like today, still hasn't lost that label of being the main party for the rich, the upper class, the landed gentry, the people that all inherited all these lands. But by World War One time, they started to try and appeal to the middle class to actually get into power because you can't just rely on one proportion of the electorate because that won't be sufficient. And a bit like World War Two, we had a coalition of parties together. The Conservative Party was in coalition with David Lloyd George from 1915 to 1918, and the Conservatives actually backed David Lloyd George as leader until roughly 1922, which their dispute became apparent, but I will get into that a little bit later on. So now I've gone through a little bit about the three main parties that you need to know about. Let's talk about how the Liberal Party declined from winning every election pretty much other than the Conservative Party to never win an election again. So one key point, as I already said, is that I need to understand that the Liberal Party split because of two leaders, Asquith and David Lloyd George, and half the party supported Asquith, half the party, supported David Lloyd George, and this obviously completely ruined their chances for election. And to understand or get an inkling of how dramatic this was, the 1918 election, when both parties obviously split and went for the election, the Liberal Party overall lost 235 seats, with Labour getting 15 and the Tories getting 60 seats. But the Liberal Party only lost that amount of seats and stayed in power because it now had the coalition Liberal, the actual wartime party, not the party pre-war. That's why they lost that many seats and maintained power. So with that, the Liberal Party with David Lloyd George won the 1918 election with a coalition with the Conservatives because they needed a coalition because they didn't have the support because the party was already split. But by now, the Conservative Party was actually probably more popular among the country out of the two. Now, David Lloyd George was also the leader, and parties are often depicted solely from the lens of what their leader is, like Johnson or Corbyn or Ed Miliband. If you've been watching politics the last couple of years and seeing how those personalities can make people go, no, I'm not voting for them, or make them support them. But David Lloyd George won the war, and like Churchill, was seen as a national hero, so everyone wants to benefit the doubt, keep voting for him. But he did the Treaty of Versailles, didn't he? And some people didn't like that. So especially straight from the Treaty of Versailles, thinking it was too lenient or too harsh, that put people off David Lloyd George straight away. Another thing, personally, through David Lloyd George, which attributed to the decline of the Liberal Party, was a scandal that happened in 1922 called the Knighthoods and Peerage Scandal. So David Lloyd George once really famously condemned it, giving away these kind of titles, but it was found out through journalism and the media that David Lloyd George had been giving people peerages and knighthoods who through like political favour. So anyone who did him a favour or did something that he needed, they'd be granted a sir or a lord and things like that. And obviously that's not going to go down well, especially as he condemned it and then went back against his words. He's now seen as a liar and untrustworthy. Just to show you the impact of that, he sold 1,500 knighthoods and hundreds of peerages. And lastly, his decision to go to war with Turkey if they didn't agree with certain terms in the Treaty of Versailles completely lost him the support, as at this time nobody wanted any conflict or war, especially with a country like Turkey that wasn't even deemed to be in Europe. And in 1922, a place called the Carlton Club, so like Carlton's in like Carlton Coal, a club there for the Conservatives, they all came, their leading members, and decided to get out of that coalition with the Liberals and go for power by themselves. So now, the 1922 election came, and David Lloyd George's Liberal Party only got 52 seats, with Asquith getting 62. So for instance, David Lloyd George's Liberal Party lost 76 seats in that election. And the main thing you need to know, so those three main reasons the Liberal Party declined, they were kind of usurped their position in the political sphere by the Labour Party mainly. And they actually won their first election in 1924, and this was huge. It's the first ever election in British history where a party representing the working class who previously didn't even have the franchise, so wasn't even allowed to vote. And this caused absolute political turmoil. However, as it was being the first one, it was only a minority government, meaning that they didn't have the majority of seats in Parliament to get through every piece of legislation, so they relied on concessions from other MPs. And because it supported working class, and like I said, it was so big and so different at the time, and completely subverted the national consensus of politics at the time, they were often compared to Soviet Russia and the communists, and that's especially particularly what the Conservatives used, and media like the Daily Mail to try and ruin Labour's chances and get the people and the public opinion on side. And also after the war, especially Germany not always paying their reparations, particularly, and obviously world trade was completely damaged. Like I said, Britain had 3.2 billion war debt after it. They Ramsay MacDonald, so the first leader of the Labour Party, had to make economic concessions and cuts. And obviously, when a party does cuts and it affects people and it ruins the publicity, and he was madly blamed for that. And like I said, he relied on minority support from other parties, and obviously this was mainly the Liberal Party. The Conservatives aren't going to support them because their policies and their ideology were completely contrast at this stage anyway. And so they couldn't even do anything really radical like they wanted to, any radical policies off, because they knew the Liberal Party would then take away the support and their government would crash and cause another election, which they were sure to lose, the Conservatives. And to highlight how fragile the party was because of the economic state, the government only lasted 9 months. So obviously in that time, the government's not going to manage to pass much meaningful legislation at all, or even show the public what it's really about. So although it lasted 9 months, it collapsed eventually because there was a motion which is called the motion of no confidence. Which, to be fair, MacDonald actually won. Basically, the allegation came from a source arguing that Labour supported some socialist newspaper, stating, with a quote, I think it was, I've got it here: refuse to shoot down your fellow workers, refuse to fight for profits, and turn your weapons on your oppressors. And obviously, this at the time it can be seen as absolute treason, and so a law case was suited against it. And then a motion of confidence happened, and obviously MacDonald won it in Parliament, but the damage had already been done by then. Again, that quote I just read out, that links again to what I said about the media, the Conservative Party largely. Compare it to Soviet Russia, and an official inquiry again was launched, and in the end MacDonald was forced to resign really to save his political career, and that resignation caused another election to occur. This one was in 1924. And because the electorate, obviously, like I said, from 1918 went from 7 million to 21 million, and that was largely just the working class population. So Labour was obviously going to have a say, as it already won what election. The Conservatives launched a campaign to try and really sediment these views of the comparison between Labour and Soviet Russia. So basically, the media picked up on something called the Zinoviev letter, which was basically a Russian MP's letter, apparently, to Labour Party inciting mutiny against Britain, and the media exposed this, even though it wasn't completely true. And then the media took this and ran with it, and the public completely believed it at the time. The Liberal Party now, by this election, completely collapsed. It lost 118 seats, and the Conservatives back in power with their leader and Prime Minister named Stanley Baldwin. And now you actually had a bit of consistency in government compared to previous years, where it was a bit like douche from different parties. But from 1924 to 1929, there was a relative peace and progression in politics, as it was a Conservative Party for 5 years and actually managed to get some meaningful policies completely through. Baldwin, actually, to be fair, was quite a good leader. He wasn't the most charismatic, but he definitely gave country aim, and he tried to appeal to the working class, and do some legislation for them and stop this comparison between Labour and the communism. So he's what you'd call one of the first consensus politicians at the time. However, a big thing happened that you need to know in 1926 called the General Strike, which I will go into in another video about industrial relations. And then in 1929, election came, and the Conservatives won more of the vote, but Labour won election. And for you that don't understand how that works, we have a system in this country called first past the post, which doesn't mean just because one party gets more votes that they'll get a seat for that constituency. It doesn't work like that at all. It's in every constituency, whether it's one in Northamptonshire, Nottinghamshire, Essex, whatever it might be, the party that receives the most votes gets 1 seat for that tiny constituency. So if the Conservative Party got more votes overall, but they might have got lots and lots of votes in one particular constituency and they won that seat, fair play, but they won it by about 50,000 votes when they didn't need to. And Labour won more seats by 1 vote. And even though the Conservatives there got so much more votes, because there was more of that vote in certain areas, and Labour's one was more well spread, they were able to win more constituencies. I'll be going through that a bit more better, a bit more clear and concise in another video as well. Or drop me a message if you don't understand that, because that can be quite complicated, but it's vital to understand anything political during on this period. But again, Ramsay MacDonald came to leadership again in 1929, but he didn't have a majority party again, so he relied on the Liberals again. But by this time, the Liberals now kind of wanted to get back into power and decided, you know what, we'll have a try and get a good relationship going with the Labour Party. MacDonald got 1930 housing legislation through, which cleared 750,000 houses and replaced them with new modern housing. The Coal Miners Act of 1930, which tried to ensure better pay for miners and better working conditions, and obviously miners traditionally a working class occupation, so they're the main voters, so they're obviously doing a piece of legislation to help them. However, again, unfortunately for Ramsay MacDonald, the government was limited in its sphere of what it could do and its the efficiency of these policies, because by 1929 still they were feeling the pinch from World War One, the debts, and obviously in 1929, anyone that knows world history or particularly American or German history, the Wall Street crash happened in 1929, didn't it? And this saw many governments in the world completely collapse. And unfortunately, Britain was no different. But 1929 to 1931, not too much politically happened, so you need to know too much. But by 1931, there was rumours of an economic catastrophe going to happen in Britain. Rumours that there was an unbalanced budget. So the government, in other words, was spending more money than it actually received. And obviously this was going to cause huge problems. And because it was spending more money than it received, this leads to borrowing. And who was borrowing money from at the time? It wasn't Germany, obviously, because they were economically quite ruined. France still ruined World War One, the biggest economy in the world at the time, namely the United States of America. And obviously America was the country that had the Wall Street crash. But because of these rumours of an unbalanced budget, American investors and banks started selling the pound at an extortionate rate. And therefore, the pound slumped in value, just meaning I'm not going to go too much into economics here because it's a bit difficult to understand and get it in the time I want to do this video in. But it basically caused massive repercussions for the UK. And actually ended up, consequently, culminating in a 10% cut in unemployment assistance. And who was usually the most unemployed? The working class, who voted for the Labour in the first place. So if you're a party that represents a certain section of society and you're implementing policies that are negatively affecting them, they're not going to vote for you, are they? You're going to lose their support. And this, a bit like the Liberal Party, threatened to split the party because it was going against its key values and policies, everything that it actually stood for. And this culminated in the government splitting in August 1931. But the King of England at the time, he urged Ramsay MacDonald to come back into power, and instead of just a Labour government, because of the troubles at the time, he asked for a national coalition. So Ramsay MacDonald being the leader, and having the Labour Party, Conservative Party, and the Liberal Party all helping each other and all leading and all having some policy contribution. But nonetheless, many Labour MPs viewed Ramsay MacDonald and his Chancellor Snowden at the time as traitors, and some of the Labour members actually formed a completely new Labour committee. It's a little bit like the the Liberal Party during World War One. So in 1931, the election obviously was won by a national government. No surprise there. And even though MacDonald was still the leader, the Conservatives at the time were the most popular. And this is particularly because the the Labour committee expelled MacDonald and Snowden as traitors, like I just said, and the public viewed this dispute as a lack of unity, and it really put people off the Labour Party, and especially because they implemented policies and they were in charge at a time of national strife during the Wall Street crash. People always blame the government of the day. So obviously they blame the government. Who are they going to vote for? Who are they going to look to? The opposition, which at the time was the Tories. And this national government was actually the government, or party, should I say, instead. No, actually, government's probably a better word, actually. That lasted till 1945 under Winston Churchill. So MacDonald was the leader of this government from 1931 to 1935. And his time, unfortunately for him, was dominated by the Great Depression that occurred after the Wall Street crash. And MacDonald didn't really, but he's the first one actually implemented some form of rearmament as Europe was slowly sliding itself towards war. But like I said, MacDonald, because of the economic situation, did 10% cut in unemployment assistance and 10% cuts to the public sector, which actually saw people like in the Navy mutiny completely. But by 1933, the economic situation started to alleviate itself through tariffs that were introduced. So obviously, when we're trading, if we trade into some other countries, we're receiving that tariff, that tax money, which overall end up helping us. And the gold standard that was introduced by the Tory parties under Baldwin. I think that was Churchill actually at the time. And that was linking our currency to gold. That's basically what we need to understand about that. By 1935, he was then replaced by the Conservative leader at the time, still Stanley Baldwin. And by 1935, the Labour government had now increased its seats in Parliament by 154 under its new leader after they got rid of MacDonald, Clement Attlee, who I'm sure a few of you know, famous for being the leader when we did the NHS. But the 1930s, you need to understand, because it was a time of political strife, economic strife, when the country is like that at a time, people look towards more extreme views, communism perhaps, fascism perhaps, and this is literally what happened. In the 1930s, there was a communist party in Britain and a fascist party in Britain. And in Britain, because of the loathing of communism that was there at the time, as you saw through the Zinonov letter earlier on, you had the fascist party under a guy called Oswald Mosley, which was more famous, and they had, I think it was, 50,000 members to his fascist party by 1935. The Communist Party of Britain, the British Communist Party, had 9,000. So Baldwin came to lead the national government in 1935, but he was rifled with poor health during his leadership at that time. And he tried to improve it by improving wages, more housing, starting to rearm. But it's integral to remember, although he wanted to rearm, there was no appetite for that really amongst the British public, as no one really believed that war was going to happen. There was the Treaty of Versailles, obviously, which many people supported, and there was a thing called the Peace Pledge Union, which had 100,000 British people supporting it. But you got to understand, Labour was doing well at this time. Obviously, under Attlee, became more united. But again, that party, as well as the Conservatives, and as well as the country, to be honest, was a bit fragmented. Completely all over the issue of rearmament, whether to rearm, whether to not. But nevertheless, it's about Baldwin, the Conservatives, because Attlee was more in the shadows at this point. Baldwin resigned after 2 years, 1937, for the famous and sometimes arguably unfairly in history, especially Neville Chamberlain. To be fair, Baldwin had done, and MacDonald to some extent, had done a good job, because Chamberlain inherited quite a nice situation actually of falling unemployment, rising living standards. So policy-wise, he did okay. He was not saying the most charismatic, but stable at least. But obviously, you all know, I won't even have to tell you about this. Obviously, in 1939, Poland invaded, and Chamberlain declared that we was at war. And also, I'll do this in another video as well, a bit more in detail. Chamberlain, famous for in the late 1930s, the appeasement policy with Hitler, which some will say was a terrible policy and could have averted war, but he didn't. And some people say it was brilliant. We had no other option. There was no appetite. Um, and that actually gave us time to rearm. But you can all make up your mind on that decision because there's no right or wrong answer with that at all. And even I don't completely know what I believe in that. Um, and with Chamberlain in 1940, there was a motion of no confidence again. Um, Failed, and he was forced to resign. And there was two options really, mainly either Lord Halifax or Winston Churchill. And Lord Halifax was rumoured to have actually wanted to submit to Germany and not fight, and try and bargain for our independence if we didn't join in the war. And then there was Churchill, who I'm sure, as you all know by now, won. And boy oh boy, did he disagree with Halifax as he declared war with Germany. So that's it for the 1918-1914 period to 1945 that you need to know. Second half of this video, I'll talk about 1945 to 1979 politics, where you'll see it went from a kind of ideology of like consensus politics to adversarial politics. So, what do I mean by consensus politics? So, after the war, there was kind of this agreement, this coherent rationale that the party should all admit and adhere to certain ideas and policies, such as supporting the NHS, the welfare state, more as keeping full employment, looking after the working class, having a mixed economy, so having some heavy industries, traditional working class industries, and having these new white collar jobs as well, more than middle class jobs. Also having a bit of a mixed economy in the sense of nationalisation, so where the government owns things and oversees things and implements it in its own way, and privatisation. Best like example for that, BT, Virgin, so where private companies own facilities and utilities and try and improve them, not because they have to, like the government would do under nationalisation, but because they want to increase profit. They need to be good and offer good services in order for us to actually go there. If Virgin Rail, for instance, was poor and no one liked the service, you wouldn't go there. You wouldn't use the service. You'd use other rail links, for instance. So there was an election in 1945, and of course, Churchill won the war. He thought he was going to win the war. And perhaps it was this cockiness, this egotism that meant that he didn't win. He didn't win the election, did he? There were some that say, yeah, exactly, he was too cocky, and some that wanted to change. They didn't want this 1930s conservatism. They wanted this new Labour kind of idea of looking after society more, and wanting change. And Churchill also made a massive political gaffe by comparing having a Labour government to having a Gestapo. And obviously, we've just come out of the war. Millions of people have been negatively affected by Nazis and the Holocaust. So doing that was an absolute blunder and likely paid the price for it with that gaffe. Another key aspect of that election actually was Labour focused on ideas like better wages, more housing, better education, where the Conservatives were more focused on the empire. And people now didn't. Obviously, they care about the empire because that was inherently Britain at the time, but people want to focus on Britain first, not the empire. So the Labour government won a massive landslide as well. They won with 393 seats, and the Conservatives got 210. Massive landslide they won by that. And then, obviously, you see Attlee, who's a leader, implement the NHS and the National Health Insurance Act, Assistance Act, 1949 Housing Act, which are all kind of self-explanatory. So the Housing Act, more housing, easier pay. And again, they were so successful during this period because the public absolutely loved it, and they loved it so much because of this landslide. That's why it became as known as consensus politics, because the Conservatives kind of left their traditional policies and outlook and came a little bit more in the middle way. So Labour started going from the left to the middle way from this communist values that were unpopular, and the Conservatives came away from this traditional conservatism and kind of came to the middle way, like I said, like a mixed economy. But in 1950, although Labour won, they still lost 78 seats, and the Conservatives gained with 85. So one, well, they were starting to lose ground. You could argue that this was by the 1949 redistribution of the Safe Seats Act. So basically, like I said, the constituencies were redistributed every 10 years. I believe there is like a consensus where they change during um, they consider a population of constituencies and change the boundaries, and they change the boundaries, and that just negatively affect Labour. So a safe seat is somewhere that you know they're going to win. So I'm going to be really stereotypical here, but say places up in Liverpool, Manchester, really traditional working class areas, are gonna be Labour safe seats. Obviously until now with Brexit, but ignore Brexit because it's a completely different ball game. So about David Cameron's time as Prime Minister, Liverpool, Manchester would always be Labour, and places such as especially Essex and Surrey would be completely mostly Conservative constituencies to safe seats. Um, Also, the working class was actually shrinking. 72% of the population viewed themselves as working class by 1931. Sorry, 78% consider themselves working class in 1931, but this was now 72% by 1950. Less people consider themselves working class, so less people consider themselves that they had to vote for Labour. And Labour also carried on rationing, which at that time was promised to have ended after World War II, but they continued it. And a bit like the Conservatives did austerity measures on 2010 onwards. Labour implemented austerity measures in there. So austerity measures means cuts in areas, pay, assistance, things like that. And by 1951, the Conservatives are now in power because they won the election. This was namely really due to Attlee losing 4 or 5 of his key ministers during that year. Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin died in 1951. Chancellor, so the second in command, Lord Cripps, resigned as well due to ill health. And in 1950, any of you that know a bit about American history and the Cold War, the Korean War occurred. And people didn't like this again because obviously warfare again, and they promised that war wasn't going to occur. And because of this increased military budget, and Hugh Gateskill, the new Chancellor in 1951, had to implement an austerity budget. And to be able to contribute in this war, they had to cut in other areas, which obviously lost them support of the public. And this budget kind of was the first real hammering into the NHS where prescription glasses and things like that now have to be paid for. And Anurin, I don't know if I said that right, even the guy who's really actually came up with the idea of the NHS now resigned because he believed that Gateskill was getting rid of his baby, his idea of the NHS, what it was. By this time, the Labour Party lost its key ministers. It didn't get rid of rationing. The constituencies were redistributed, and mainly austerity was the main thing, and that Attlee no longer had the ability to manage these disputes that were going on in his party. And now you had a massive era, of conservative dominance now from the year 1951 to 1964. That was mainly due to conservatives being really clever here and nicking the good parts, like I said, this consensus of what was really popular with Labour, with the NHS, the welfare state, and a bit of nationalisation, and mixed it with the Conservatives' own popular things, such as low taxes and things like that. And so much so, The Economist in 1954 named the Conservative politics as Bustskellism. So the shadow chancellor for Labour was obviously still Hugh Gateskill, and the current Conservative chancellor at the time was called Rab Butler. That's why they called it Bustskellism policy at the time. You don't need to know too much. In 1951, 75, Churchill was in power. He ended rationing, which was good, popular, but he was very old at this time, not very well. More seen as a caretaker prime minister actually, as he was dubbed. In 1955, he was replaced with Anthony Eden, who called an election in 1955 just to get his own political mandate at the time, and they won comfortably, showing that the country liked his policies and the conservative way at the moment. However, Eden would lose his popularity in the Conservatives' image heavily damaged after a thing called the Suez Crisis. So India and other countries got their independence from the Empire. India in 1947, and there was a canal called the Suez Canal, which was now seen as the main way to get oil through Europe to America to part of Asia. But the Egyptian leader at the time, Nasser, wanted it to be in Egypt's hands. The canal, they believed it belonged to them. He occupied it, and Eden didn't like this, as he viewed it as part of British imperialism, belonged to Britain. And he believed that, but exactly at this time after World War II, the Cold War ruled everything, and he believed that the Soviet Union would get their hands on this key canal. And France and Israel actually invited Britain to invade Egypt to make sure they get this canal. And Anthony Eden said yes. But our biggest ally and the most powerful country in the world at the time, America, led by Dwight Eisenhower at the time, was not told. Britain didn't tell its main ally, and Eisenhower was a military man, famous general, and a very proud man, and didn't take to this kindly at all. And Eisenhower actually threatened to sell the pound at a ridiculous rate, which would have negatively affected the economy. So Britain was kind of stuffed. It was forced to withdraw from Egypt in 1957, and it was a huge embarrassment to the Conservative Party, and even had to resign. And the big thing from that is that now Britain was no longer a world power. It really wasn't. It couldn't do anything now, as it was seen to, without America's backing or say so. So in 1957, though, the Conservatives still won. Now with Harold Macmillan as leader, and he was leading at a time with better social mixing, social classes, living standards, wages, and a time when the economy was actually preparing itself very well. A couple of MPs in 1959 did resign. One famous one, very notorious for his Rivers of Blood speech, Enoch Powell, resigned, as well as MP called Thornycroft and Birch, because they viewed the government as spending too much money, more money than we could afford. And obviously, spending on money can cause inflation, and they believed inflation was the real threat to Britain, not unemployment, as Macmillan was trying to avoid by spending more, but they believed inflation. In 1962, Macmillan and his party, his cabinet in particular, was seen as outdated, full of aristocrats. So there was a movement or an event dubbed as the Night of the Long Lives, which saw Anthony sack several ministers that were linked to these peerages and this old gentry and aristocracy. He took out 7 and replaced them with younger lads, and tried to create this idea of meritocracy, where you could get the places through your work and your worth, rather than where you came from. Ill stress got to Macmillan in the end, and he was replaced with Alex Douglas Home, who was previously a lord and actually had to. He felt like he had to. He came out of his lordship. He gave up his lordship to become prime minister. He was only prime minister for a year, because in 1964 Labour came back into power. However, when Wilson came to power with Chancellor Callaghan, they found the country was in £800 million budget deficit. So the Conservatives under Macmillan especially didn't leave the country in a great economic headspace at all. Now, Wilson had promised to build new houses, help the elderly with their pensions, and now you make these promises in your manifesto, but they found that obviously they weren't economically viable because of the situation. He didn't want to go back on his promises, so his only option really was devaluing the pound, making the value of the pound literally come down in value what it was worth. And this devaluation allows the government to pay off debts easier because the pound becomes cheaper. But alas, Wilson didn't want to do this. He didn't want to be seen a party. He didn't want Labour to be seen as the party of devaluation, because it was obviously a negative kind of is negatively viewed by the public as weak. In 1967, he was forced to devalue the pound anyway. So 1966, because in 1964 he got minority, in 1966 he got majority, um, and obviously he devalued the pound in 1967. But he launched some new universities, the Open University, which was the first university which you could subscribe to, but learn from home. Didn't have to be at the university, which was great for especially for elderly people. He obviously did laws on homosexuality and abortion as well in 1967, which were controversial at the time, but nonetheless, Labour wanted to be seen as a party that was classless, that didn't judge. But Wilson's party really became under fire during the late 1960s and early 70s because of the strikes that I went through in the economy, and I'll go through the industrial actions video. And unemployment was rising as well. And the strikes and unemployment culminated in the 1970 election, which Edward Heath won, so the Conservatives are back in power. And this really, Heath, is where the post-war consensus, this mixed economy, really broke. He completely wanted to break from it. He made a manifesto called the Seltzer Manifesto, which, interestingly enough, Thatcher, for instance, was a part of. Which is a manifesto which really wanted to break from this consensus that I said. His first policy featured lots of tax cuts, and he got rid of Wilson's national income policy with the boards. So Wilson's policy there was that the government would control the market, for instance, but Heath got rid of this. He wanted free market capitalism. So the market itself sees the economic situation of the country instead of the government determining it. But these tax cuts by Chancellor Barber failed to improve the economic situation, and inflation was rising. And Heath, within 18 months, 2 years, had to do a U-turn on his Seltzer Manifesto, which we want tax cuts. He had to increase state intervention. So he broke his manifesto, and it's lost a lot of support within the party because he broke it. And he went against everything that he said in the election. And he had trade unions problems. So in the industrial video, I'll go through in Arthur Scargill in particular, and the unions that caused him real trouble. And these strikes culminated in election, which he asked for to get a mandate to say who runs the country. That was what the title was dubbed. Was it the unions who kept striking, or was it the government with Heath? And unfortunately, Labour won. So Heath did not get what he wanted. And in 1974, James Callaghan came to power. No, tell a lie. James Callaghan was still Chancellor, actually. This was Heath's third time. So he won the election in 64, won election in 1966, and then won election in 1974 as well. By now, Wilson was old. His ideas were a bit outdated. He wasn't as charismatic as he once was. And because he was old, he didn't have the power nor the magnetism to control his party. It was now split mainly into 3 main fractions. There was one section with him and James Callaghan, who are more moderate members, which wanted monetarism. You got a soft left led by famous Michael Benn, more pro-union than Wilson probably was, and he had a hard left led by Tony Benn, who wanted radical economic ideas, such as something called a siege economy. But Wilson, in the end, due to ill health and becoming old and becoming largely dissatisfied with his party, resigned in 1976, called an election in which James Callaghan won and became leader. James Callaghan was actually well liked by society largely, but he had something in 1979 called the Winter of Discontent, which I will go through in the industrial action video. And that Winter of Discontent, Google it for yourselves, have a little look, really interesting stuff. Completely brought the country to a standstill, and ended up causing an election in which Maggie Thatcher came to power, and who would be in power for many years. So that's it. For this video, you've seen how the Liberal Party were at start the biggest party in politics and completely lost their way due to the Labour government, Labour movement forming, and that they had breaks with Asquith and David Lloyd George, and then Labour couldn't win because of the economic strife had to do. And then you had the Conservatives trying to become more middle-minded, more middle ground. And then you had the War government focused on the war and rearmament. And a little sum up after World War II was a consensus with Attlee leading, creating the welfare state. It's really popular. Churchill continuing it, Anthony Eden continuing it, Macmillan continuing it, Douglas Home, Wilson continuing it until Edward Heath. That's the key person who really wanted to end it in 1970, but obviously he couldn't. James Callaghan, and then Maggie Thatcher in 1980, who really was the first person to implement Heath's ideas and completely destroy the national consensus at the time, and really, really create the adversarial politics we see in today's society.